All right, let's jump right in. Today we're diving into an incredibly powerful explainer that translates some deeply ancient philosophical wisdom into a highly practical guide for us today. We're tackling what is arguably our most universal modern struggle, overthinking and the restless mind. We're going to break down a profound dialogue that maps out exactly why we feel so scattered all the time, and far more importantly, how we can actually take our power back. But before we get any further, I want you to honestly ask yourself a pretty tough question. Are you actually in control of your thoughts, or are your thoughts controlling you? Is your mind your master? It's a heavy thing to think about, right? Just consider how often you sit down, determined to focus, only to find yourself spiraling into anxieties, past regrets, or literally any distraction available. So who is really running the show up there? Now, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by that realization, let me assure you, you are definitely not alone. The source material captures this exact frustration with a pretty stunning comparison. It states that attempting to tame the restless mind is literally as difficult as trying to catch the blowing wind with your bare hands. It feels completely impossible, doesn't it? The mind is just inherently turbulent. But the ancient texts assure us that while it's incredibly difficult, it is absolutely not impossible. Okay, so to figure out how to win, we first have to understand our opponent. The mind acts almost like a trickster. According to the text, it intoxicates us with the heavy wine of our own ego and traps us in an endless web of illusions, something often referred to as Maya. It basically forces us to swing like a pendulum between celebrating these fleeting little joys and then singing songs of sorrow when they pass. It keeps us so busy dancing to its tune of endless desires that we literally never get a quiet moment to discover who we really are. Moving on to section 1, the chariot of the body. To really visualize this intense internal struggle, the text gives us one of the most brilliant metaphors in philosophical history: the chariot. What's so fascinating here is how clearly it assigns a role to every single part of our consciousness. The chariot itself, that's your physical body. The horses pulling it are your senses, your eyes, ears, taste, touch. The charioteer, the driver holding the reins, is your mind. And the master, the one sitting quietly in the back who actually owns the whole shebang, is your soul. Let's look at how this setup usually leads to a total chain reaction of chaos. Step 1, worldly objects call out, tempting the senses. Step 2, our horses, those senses, wildly run toward those temptations. And step 3, the charioteer, our mind, just blindly lets it happen. Instead of listening to the master, the soul, the mind just gets dragged wherever those wild horses want to go. It completely ignores the soul's command. So here is the absolute crucial point, this sharp contrast at the heart of the struggle between the restless mind and the soul. If your mind remains uncontrolled and just serves whatever the senses want, you stay chained to those worldly illusions. You're just constantly being dragged through the mud. But if you empower the soul to take command of the mind, everything flips. The mind suddenly acts as this perfect, expert driver, steering your chariot straight toward peace and true liberation. This brings us to section 2, the two swords of control. So, the million-dollar question: how do we snatch those reins back from a driver who's been running wild our entire lives? To solve this, the text introduces a dual approach. Think of them as two metaphorical swords that you absolutely need. First, on the left, we have practice, or abhyasa. That's the active taming of the mind. And on the right, we have detachment, or vairagya, the passive letting go of illusions. You can't just forcefully wrestle the mind into submission. You have to balance that by actively cutting away the shiny illusions that tempt it in the first place. Let's zoom in on that first sword: practice. And listen, this isn't some one-off weekend retreat kind of thing. We're talking about relentless, continuous effort. Every single time you sit down to focus, and your mind inevitably runs off to a worry, a random memory, or the urge to check your notifications, you have to actively catch it and drag it back to the present, over and over and over. The text actually gives us another great analogy for this. Think of your mind like a wild, newborn horse. If you try to ride it, it is not going to stand still for a second. It'll resist, it'll fight, and it will throw you off repeatedly. That's exactly what happens when you first try to meditate, right? But through persistent struggle, a determined rider gets right back on. Eventually, through sheer repetition, that wild horse is going to obey every single command. But here's where things get incredibly deep. You might be sitting there wondering, okay, once my mind is tamed and focused through all this practice, why do I even need the second sword? If the wild horse is broken, aren't we good to go?
Well, actually no, and it's because of the environment that horse lives in. We desperately need the second sword, detachment. See, detachment is this profound realization that worldly pleasures, status, wealth, physical indulgences are really just temporary illusions. They're Maya. Without detachment, your beautifully tamed mind is eventually going to be seduced right back into its old destructive habits by the false promises of the world.
Detachment is your absolute ultimate safeguard. It works by cutting the very root of those worldly temptations. It totally erases the craving for fleeting physical pleasures because it sees them for what they really are, hollow. Detachment essentially makes your mind realize that the track the horse wants to run on is entirely fake. When the mind genuinely understands that truth, it drops the desire to chase after the illusions, transforming from a restless trickster into a disciplined sage. Which leads perfectly into section 3, reaching the ultimate truth. So, what is the grand finale here? What happens when we actually pull this off, wielding both practice and detachment to quiet all that internal noise? Well, when the mind is finally still, an amazing shift happens. For the very first time, we aren't constantly distracted by the outside world. When the mind stops making us dance on its ropes of desire, we finally get the free, clear space to look inward. And that is when we truly recognize the radiant light of our own soul. The soul is no longer just a trapped passenger. It's revealed in its full glory. And the ultimate reward of this massive internal struggle, it's a profound, totally unshakable peace. The text beautifully describes this as the stabilized mind allowing the soul to safely descend into the limitless ocean of divine truth. You are no longer just bouncing from one temporary joy to one temporary sorrow. You are finally anchored in something eternal and vast. To wrap this explainer up, I want to leave you with one absolutely vital question to chew on today. Who is driving your chariot right now? Are your wild senses dragging you around to every new distraction, or is your soul firmly holding the reins, using practice and detachment to steer you toward actual, lasting peace? The choice, and for sure the hard work, is entirely up to you.